Today, we have Reggie with us, who is basically an Argo CD contributor. She has participated in quite a lot of different stories and trying to help spread the GitOps way of doing things. So, Reggie, do you want to take off?
Sure. Thank you, Amit. Thank you for the introduction. I'm very excited to be here today. So let's begin.
Awesome.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Reggie. I'm an open source software tech lead at Code by Octopus Deploy. I'm also an Argo CD Maintainer and a CNCF Ambassador. And ever since I was a little child, I was always the only female somewhere. I was the only girl in class, one of the few women speaking about DevOps and platform engineering areas. And lately, I have also become one of the few female open source contributors. Me and my husband have 2 boys, so I am outnumbered even in my own family. Now, Argo CD is a very popular open source project, and in Argo CD, we are 41 maintainers, out of which there are only 4 women, so maybe some of the next contributors and Argo CD maintainers can be the ladies in this audience. A couple of quick words about CodeFresh GitOps by Octopus Deploy, my company. We offer Argo control plane and promotions, along with Argo enterprise support and technical account managing. We also offer hardened distro for Argo and the #1 GitOps training and certification with over 23,000 of students worldwide. And so now we're going to discuss what is new in Argo CD 2.13, in Argo CD 2.14 releases. Both of those releases are packed with security improvements, performance improvements, and maintainability features and fixes. So let's dive straight in. Troubleshooting application sets. The long-wanted feature to preview the application sets before their actual creation is this new command. It's called Argo CD Upset Generate, and this will help you validate the application resources that would be created by this application set, but before you actually apply this to the cluster. So let's see this in action. Just a second. Okay, so I hope that you can see my screen. So this is my simple application set resource. You can see that it uses the cluster generator, which should produce applications for every cluster that my Argo CD manages. It's a pretty simple application. Now let's have a look at how many clusters I have. So I have a single cluster, the local cluster, and I'm expecting the application set to produce a single application, and boom, boom, here we go. You can see in this application that the server name and the application name were produced and templated correctly. So let's go back to the additional features. Argo CD Upset Create in dry run mode is another way to troubleshoot application sets and to validate the application set template on the server prior to the actual creation. The next feature is actually a security feature. Decoupling control plane and application sync privileges is a security features with which Argo CD can be configured in a more secure way. This feature relies on Kubernetes impersonation, which is the ability of one user to act as another user. And so this enables us to separate the permissions of Argo CD control plane from the permissions with which sync is performed. And now the sync process can be performed with less privileged service accounts. And this service account can be configured on the application project. And this means that the permissions on Kubernetes resources can now be managed with native Kubernetes RBAC, relying on this service account, role, and role binding. And the service account, role, and role binding should be pre-configured for this feature to work. And this means that now for every cluster and every namespace, you can specify a service account on the application project and leverage the Kubernetes RBAC for this. This can actually help Argo CD administrators work easier. It's important to note that this feature is actually an alpha feature. So first of all, this means that you have to explicitly enable it because it doesn't come enabled by default. And second, this means that this feature is still young and it can be changing during the time. So this is an example of how this would look like. The destinations is something that you're probably already familiar with. And this is the new field that is called destination service account. And so you can see that basically we now have server namespace and a service account name. And we can have a combination of such because we can have different service accounts for different namespaces in the cluster. So let's see this in action. This is my application project, which is using the new impersonation sync feature. And you can see the example that I have just described. We have the usual destination, and then we have the service accounts section. And in this case, for my local cluster and guestbook dev namespace, I will be using a service account called guestbook dev service account. And this one was pre-created in the cluster ahead of time. Now let's see an application that is going to use this project. So the application is using this impersonation sync project on the left. And this application will install resources to guestbook dev namespace on my local cluster. And this is the path where the manifests for this application are. The guestbook dev folder. Now let's see which manifests we're going to sync. We are going to try and sync a config map. Let's take a look at the role with which this service account is operating. So you can see that for this role, there are services, daemon sets, deployments, replica sets, and stateful sets, which are allowed, but config map resource is not allowed. And so now let's see what happens when we try to create this application in the cluster. So the application was created, and you can see that one or more objects failed to apply. Let's see why. Yes, config maps is not allowed for this service account, which is the expected behavior. And so the sync of this application failed. It tried to sync a resource that it was not allowed. And you can actually see, again, that the config map was not part of what was allowed in this role. Now, if we will compare the Argo project with the old style before this feature, you can see that if I specify those resources on the project, I can achieve the same thing that I achieve with specifying them on the Kubernetes role. But the difference essentially lies in the following thing. If I'm specifying those things on the Argo CD project, then I'm not fully relying on Kubernetes RBAC. And when I'm moving those configurations into an Kubernetes role, I'm relying on Kubernetes RBAC. And actually, this can help me prevent some duplication. Imagine that I have a couple of development teams, and each of those teams can basically create the same kind of resource. Let's say that all the teams can create deployments, services, and replica sets. So I can create one cluster role in the cluster and then bind this role to different service accounts that would be present in different namespaces. And so configuring this role can happen one time. And if I were to configure this on the application projects, then I would have to go and duplicate this configuration on each Argo project relevant for each such team. So this feature can actually help me. I encourage you to try this feature and to provide feedback on this, how useful this is to you, and also we would like to hear the potential directions this feature could take. And so now back to our slides. Next feature is the multi-source application, which just moves from beta to stable. And this marks its overall maturity along with full UI and CLI support. Application in any namespace regex support. So before we dive into the regex support, I want to have a quick recap of what the application in any namespace feature is. And so application in any namespace allows developers and other personas in the organizations who are not Argo CD admins to be able to create applications on their own. And this is possible by specifying the allowed namespaces on the application project. Now, this feature is not new, and when this feature was firstly introduced, the option to specify the allowed namespaces was to actually whitelisting them on the application project. And now with this new feature of the regex support, it is possible to use regex to specify those application namespaces. And this actually simplifies configuration, and it also helps us to better leverage naming conventions. For example, if the name of my team is present both in the application project and in the namespace name, I can configure it more easily following this convention with the regex. Improvements in working with monorepo. A quick recap for what does it mean working with monorepo and what is the manifest generate path annotation for. So monorepo can mean multiple things to multiple people, but in the context of working with Argo CD and synchronizing applications, we're talking about a single repo with a single branch in which we can have potentially many folders that are for many business applications or for many infrastructure applications. And so, for example, if I have application A that is watching folder A, and I have application B that is watching folder B in this same branch, if someone commits to folder A, then both application A and application B will be refreshed by Argo CD. And in order for an application to be refreshed only when its manifests are changed in Git, it was introduced an annotation called manifest generate path. So basically, when people are working with monorepo, it's very common to work also with the manifest generate path annotation. So there was a bug which happened when the manifest generate path annotation was used for monorepo and when self-heal was not enabled. And then some Kubernetes resource changed at runtime, either by some controller running in the cluster or by some manual intervention. So under these circumstances, there was a bug. that caused an undesirable reverse sync. And this bug was resolved, resulting in better experience in working with monorepos. Reduce Redis traffic for application resource tree. Argo CD's application resource tree, or in other words, the resources that application is managing, are persisted in Redis. And until now, they were persisted under a single key in Redis. And this means that if we have a big application that manages a lot of resources, then upon each change in an application resource, this whole big value in Redis would be changed. And so the more resources they are, the bigger this traffic to Redis was. And this new feature is actually allowing to configure a shard, which means that I can take all the resources that my application manages and split them across multiple keys in Redis. And so when a certain resource changes, then only a small part in Redis would be updated and not the big part of the whole application. This is possible with configuring Argo CD application tree shard size, which is 0 by default, and a good value for big applications would be 100. And so this makes the sharding of the resource updates for Redis, it makes this resource updates more efficient. In the UI, there is now a new button to show and hide parameter details in the history and rollback. And this is actually useful for applications that have both many revisions and both many parameters. And so now those parameters can be either hidden or shown, and the overall scrolling through this history and rollback page is much better. I encourage you to read more in the 2.13 release blog. And I think now would be a good time for any question that you have about the feature or fixes that I have just showed. If you do have questions, please feel free to ask them. Okay, so it looks like we're going straight to 2.14 then. So with the 2.14 release, the first notable feature is the ability to configure global sync timeout for applications. And this is relevant for cases when we have a sync that is running and it looks stuck because actually it is constantly retrying because some resource didn't manage to start correctly. And so in this case, this sync can just indefinitely hang or be constantly retrying. And now there is an option to configure a global parameter which would cause this long sync to time out after a certain period of time. Disable server-side apply on individual resources. So a quick recap, what is the server-side apply? Server-side applied is actually a native feature of Kubernetes that helps with with better declarative resource updates, and it also helps to resolve conflicts on resources when those resources were updated in the cluster. And so Argo CD introduced support for this at version 2.10, and since that support became available, it's actually now a very common use case to configure the server-side apply globally. This new feature is enhancing the control of individual resources configuration by introducing the ability for a certain resource not to use the server-side apply. So we have bigger control and better configuration. Control produced Kubernetes events. For clusters where there are many Argo CD applications or applications with high churn, meaning with many resource updates, the events that Argo CD is producing can actually produce load on the Kubernetes API server and on the etcd. And so now there is an option to control whether those events would be produced at all by Argo CD, and we can just specify none so that Argo CD doesn't produce any new events of its own. Or there is an option to enable just specific events, like status refresh or resource created. And so this helps reduce load from Kubernetes API for clusters that have many applications or many resources managed by Argo CD. Resource protection from deletion and pruning. So there are cases, for example, when we're talking about namespaces in the production environments, when we would want to kind of require additional thought before deleting the namespace so that someone maybe doesn't delete it by mistake. And so now there is an option to configure on this particular resource an annotation that would tell Argo CD that either deletion or pruning could only take place after a manual confirmation. And this confirmation can be performed on the UI level, on the CLI level, or even by annotating the application with a special annotation. So let's see this in action. Okay, let's give it one more try. Okay, so something just went wrong with this demo. But anyway, what happens in this case, and I will be going back to my slides right now. So for the ability to confirm the deletion and pruning, actually one of the buttons in the UI is changing, and then you can press on it to actually confirm this pruning or deletion. And this is also important when someone is deleting an application in a cascading way, which means that application is deleted along with all its resources. So if one of the resources is marked with this deletion confirmation annotation, then the application deletion would only resume after someone confirms that, yes, indeed, this resource also will have to be deleted. Configure faster application refreshes. And so for this feature, it's important to understand that Argo CD is caching all the cluster resources in a cluster cache. And for applications that have tens of thousands of pods or replica sets, each time such resource is changing, then this cache would have to be updated. And the more resources are there, the more time it takes to actually update this cluster cache. And for those cases, Argo CD UI can become really slow. And so now there is an option to configure this so that those updates are not processed every time every small update occurs, but they're processed in batches. And so this configuration should be set to true, and then the processing interval should be also specified. So for applications that are small, that manage small amounts of resources, and for Argo CD that has small amounts of applications, this processing interval should be very slow so that these changes are picked up quickly. But for clusters that have high churn, or that they have multiple pods and multiple resources, this value should be higher. And when this value is set to higher, then the contention on the cluster cache would be actually much, much less. And this would result in your application be able to refresh more quickly. Exponential backoff for self-heals. And so self-heal is a configuration that enables Argo CD to identify the changes in the cluster and to reapply your source of truth from Git at that moment in an automatic way. And there are many cases when your resource in Git actually gets changed in the cluster by some controller that is running there. And in those cases, when the controller changes the resource and you have self-heal on, then Argo CD would go and reapply the manifest from Git. But then the controller will probably go and change this manifest again. And then Argo CD would go and reapply this again. And so here we may be in a position of entering a certain loop. And for those situations, it's very helpful to enable exponential backoff. And exponential backoff actually means that at the first times that Argo CD is needed to self-heal, it does it with a short interval. But for the next times, the interval between its self-heals will actually go and grow bigger. And this behavior, this exponential backoff, could actually reduce load from Kubernetes API. And another change in the UI is actually related to the new button that I talked about for 2.13. And in 2.14, this new UI addition has actually become even better. And now you can see that we have a panel with those source parameters, and you can press on it to either hide or show those. So this looks even better at the native Argo CD UI. And let's see it in action. So you can see that I have a history with a couple of revisions. This is what happens when I click on the source parameters panel. I can either hide or show those parameters. And overall, for applications that have multiple revisions with multiple parameters, the scrolling experience is going to be much, much better. And this is it for now. I encourage you to read more in the 2.14 release blog, to read about other features and fixes that were in this release. And you're also very welcome to contact me on LinkedIn or on Slack CNCF channel. And if there are any questions now on the 2.14 fix and features or on the 2.13, then please go ahead and ask them. I would love to answer.
We do have a question, Reggie.
Sure.
Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. Hi, Regina. Thanks for walking us through this update. My question is around, it's kind of a generic question, but it's around Argo workflows. So we make use of Argo CD, and part of the application set there is an Argo workflow that we make use of. And I kind of find the way the Argo workflow responds to Git changes a bit kind of a bit hard to follow. It's very hard to update the Argo workflow upon a Git sync. So I just want to understand if you guys have any plans of enhancing the kind of compatibility of Argo workflows inside the application set. Or maybe I'm not using it right, I'm not sure, but just want to get your thoughts on how Argo workflows fit in within your development plans.
Could you elaborate a bit more on how you're using application set with Argo workflows today? How are you using this combination?
So we do have, I think there is an Argo workflow template, which where we define all the various stages for a set of jobs that we want to do. And that is part of an application set. And when you do a sync for the first time, it syncs very well and it tries to execute each of the jobs in whichever sequence you define. It works perfectly fine. And after which, if I make any new changes within the code snippet or the config map of the Argo workflow, it does sync the changes, but when I try to click sync, the workflow doesn't really trigger. So I'm not sure if I'm able to explain to you properly, but long story short, the Argo workflow works fine for the initial sync, but future syncs, it fails to pick up the change, and I have to manually go into my Argo CD prompt and execute a bunch of commands to trigger the Argo workflow afresh. So
I see.
That is tricky to handle. So that's an open question. So I actually, one of my close friends is a contributor of Argo CD. He's one of the members. So when I met him, I asked him about that, and he kind of said like, there's some work happening on Argo workflow. So I'm really not sure. But since you presented the various releases, I was wondering if you have any inputs on future works on Argo workflows.
Actually, I'm less involved with Argo workflows, but if you write me on Slack or on LinkedIn and provide me some of the configuration you have, then I may be able to provide more assistance.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Reggie. That was a wonderful overview of the two different Argo versions that we are talking about, Argo CD. And hopefully we have a lot more such meetups where we can walk through what's latest and greatest and what are the latest features within Argo CD so that people can adopt them and implement them within their respective systems where it fits in. Thanks once again. And hopefully we get some more questions on YouTube, and I'll pass your information on LinkedIn so that anyone who has any questions can contact you via LinkedIn or the CNCF Slack channel.
Sure.
Thank you, Reggie.
Thank you so much, Amit. Thank you so much. I was very excited to be here. Thank you.
Same here, Reggie. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.